Thank you all for coming. We'll probably have some people filing in over the next few minutes. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rails Wednesday reading series. This is the 91st of these weekly readings that started in the fall of 2020. And it's the 587th episode of the New Social Environment overall. And we're very pleased to have this reading put together by Mona Kareem. And Mona will be joined by Sara Elkamel and in reading, and then Mirene Arsanios will join us after Mona and Sara have read, and will facilitate a conversation between them that may then open up out into involve folks in the audience if questions arise. Before I introduce Mona, I will just mention that if you're here for the first time, you might want to pay attention to the chat as the reading goes on. There will be links put up to various works by our distinguished readers, and there'll be some information about the Rail as well. My name's Anselm Berrigan. I'm the poetry editor for the Rail, and also the person who greets everybody and reads intros on Wednesdays. Now, Mona is going to read first. Mona Kareem is a poet, translator, and scholar. She's the author of 3 poetry collections, most recently the trilingual chapbook Femme Ghosts from Publication Studio. She received a 2021 NEA literary grant and has been a fellow at the Center for the Humanities at Tufts University. Her work has appeared, her translations and poems have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail and also in the Michigan Quarterly Review and other publications. She's held fellowships through Princeton Poetry International, the Arab American National Museum, the Norwich Center for Writing, and Forum Transregional Studien. Her translations include Ashraf Fayyad's Instructions Within and Rad Abdul Qadir's Except for This Unseen Thread. Please welcome Mona Kareem to the Rail.
Thank you, Anselm. Thank you all for joining us today on this weird, cloudy summer day. Yeah, I will read, I think, 6 poems, most of which are new work. And I guess I divide them by language because I'm mainly a poet in Arabic, but because of exile, I've been writing poems in English as well. But on this occasion, the poems I'm going to read in English translation are done by Sara Elkamel. So we are, connected in different ways and through different practices. But I will start with the poems that I wrote in English, and I label them as untranslations. Which is maybe something we can discuss more in the conversation part. But yeah, this first poem is titled Nebraska. It's been a long night tonight. I have sent in my application for a sleep permit hours ago. I-444. I got a notification it is being processed at the Nebraska Center for Insomniac Aliens. They first returned it saying, I checked the wrong application type in my answer to question F2. They even returned the check voided. I've put on my nightly dress 13 times, trying to trick my body into tricking this 24/7 capitalist cycle into pausing. I refiled my application, this time ticking the right choice. I folded the clouds into paper planes. I waited for the rain to come in my mouth. I counted all the sheep in this nation. Maybe I licked the wrong stamp. Maybe the postman is still at the trap house. Or maybe they don't speak English in Nebraska. The second poem is titled The Room of Escape and Leisure. In the room of escape and leisure, the lights are always on. If you're passing by, you might mistake it for the dim glow of a falling miracle. On its wall, a woman with her baby and goats sits still on their knees, looking up towards the sky, painted in watercolors. They pray in a cracked moment as a spaceship is fired into freedom, a prayer for modernity that flies in the wet eyes of a naive monk. Even on the far corner, there are rosaries hung for urgent use. In the room of escape and leisure, there is no God, but believers. 6 shelves, 3 stands, and 4 stacks of butterflies roaming around. Be careful not to dance too heavy on the hardwood floors. The landlord will put your miracle to flames. Okay, Ode to the Security Woman. The security woman at the airport rubbed on my pussy like she wants it. She had to keep her job interesting, they told me. Every day she violates people's bodies to protect the nation's honor. Grope them by the pussy is the new war on terror. The security woman rubbed on my pussy like it was Aladdin's lamp. She wished to fold my body like a carpet, flying her away on a mythical tour from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib. The security woman already knows my pussy is too tight for anything but love. Okay, now from the Arabic in translation by Sara Elkamel, my body, my vehicle. I guess I'm really disembodied. My body is my vehicle. I drive her like a reckless teen. She crashes into others, into sidewalks. She brakes, red lights at the last second as the death policeman shakes his head. Sometimes I lose one of my features, a strand of hair or an organ, and I find no spare parts in the junkyard. I lost my silver lips and my grease-coated heart, and I lost my rotating hat, then my left hand, and with it, my peripheral vision. Like a Canadian man on Mondays, I start the engine softly and shovel the surrounding snow. I let her warm up and come alive, regain her senses, for no vehicle rises from bed ready to face the street. In the room, I let her roam. Every time an idea struggles for air, she scratches with her unkempt nails the wooden floors, waiting for language until it unfurls, easing the crisis. What do I do with this vehicle of mine? I cannot park her, abandon her anywhere. When I go shopping, my wheels shatter the glossy ceramic floors. And when I go to the beach, she sinks her teeth into the sand. Small and dark and broken, her windows are an almanac of winds, and her voice falters at rush hour. Yeah, these last 2 poems, more recent poems, and my next collection in Arabic, which is titled like Words Don't Come Easy. At least for now it's titled that, and a lot of it touches on exile through the experience of the artist. So this poem is The Migrant Poet Slaughters His Voice, and it appeared in the Brooklyn Rail May issue. One scorching summer, warmer than the previous summer and crueler than the next, the poet journeyed from the upper south to the lower south. He descended, and at the fringe of a rock slaughtered his voice, just like that, calmly, his narrow eyes squinting in distress. He did not read Al-Fatiha, nor did he pledge this sacrifice to Allah. The poet was exasperated that his voice had become a metaphor. He wanted to see the blood of his voice, its lard and flesh, its lineage, to hear its chords vibrating, even if a single utterance would cost him his life. In our language, he finds himself placing nouns before verbs, tainted by the lyrical eye, perhaps. He picks words that had wilted until they turned to gold, wiping away the dust of the centuries. He plants them in small pots. The poet thinks he can heal the dumb and revive the dead. Meanwhile, in their language, he crosses mountains and oceans, leaving a talisman on every tree to find his way back. He hauls a mountain from the slopes of California and flings it into the Gulf of Mexico before it floats once again atop an oil pipeline. Every morning I wake up to his voice. I slam the window in its face and go back to sleep. I let him jumble the clocks and talk to me about the prose poem, how it stands like a bear trunk, interrupting the horizon. They have stolen our music. And nothing's left but the voice that reaches me across time zones, afflicted with insomnia, burdened with beginnings, stuck like an eternal cry in the chasm of time. This last poem is titled Luts Wife. And in Arabic, Luts Wife actually has a name. Her name is Waliha, and also some say Wali'a. And if there's a way to translate this poem, this name, because Arabic names actually always have meanings and translatable. So Waliha comes from longing, like imagine like the longer, right? if that's a word, the one who longs basically, in the feminine. And if you know the story, she does long, right? So this one is about her and about her longing and perhaps mine too. Luts Wife stands near the entrance, deformed more radically by the artist than she had ever been by the Lord. The artist didn't preserve her salty body. Instead, he restored her in bronze, crafting a prisoner of eternity. She can't visit the neighbors to gossip about her new visitors. She can't even cross the gallery's threshold. Mummified and silent, she overhears fleeting conversations, surveys countenances with incurious eyes, people of various races, jinn, humans, and angels, walk past her daily. In a past life, she squirmed if she had to carry strangers' stories in her belly. She would wander the neighborhood, disgorging one tale after the other. She is no longer a threat to secrets. Now, Luts Wife pays the price for her fleeting nostalgia, her passion for the past, which compelled her to take one last look at Sodom. Looking back, she barely managed to archive the colors of her life, barely captured the morning scent before it went missing, together with geography. She barely swallowed the language whose extinction would turn her dreams obsolete. At the border checkpoint, a migrant is not allowed to occupy herself with anything but the present moment. It has been said that in turning back, she had compromised the identity of the Lord, or that in her gut, she believed Sodom innocent, wrongly battered to dust. Perhaps if Lot's wife had waited until she got to the cave before letting nostalgia overwhelm her, the plot of cosmology would have gone in an entirely different direction. In fact, it might have ended in that cave and left us in peace. Why couldn't the Lord understand that all she wanted was to write a poem about ruins? Is it because men have a sole claim to ruin? She looks tiny on the plinth, her head like a newborn with no talent for wailing. The artist has stripped Luke's wife of her limbs. Perhaps he feared she would escape the gallery and travel back to the underworld. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. And thank you for putting this together. Our next reader is going to be Sara Elkamel. Sara is the author of the chapbook Field of No Justice, published by the African Poetry Book Fund and Akashic Books in 2021. Her poems have appeared in Poetry Magazine, the Yale Review, Gulf Coast, the Cincinnati Review, Poet Lore, Poetry London, Best New Poets 2020, and Best of the Net 2020, among others. She holds an MA in Arts Journalism from Columbia University and an MFA in Poetry from NYU. And she lives between her hometown, Cairo, and New York. Please welcome Sara to the rail.
Thank you so much, Eltham, and thank you so much to the Brooklyn Rail for having us and having this reading and conversation, and for Mona for inviting me, and Mirene for joining us. I'm very nervous. I don't know why. But Mona, your poems are gorgeous and they sound so great in your voice. Okay, I'll just get into it. I'd like to start by with a poem that I am going to dedicate to Ali Abdel Fattah, who is an Egyptian activist currently behind bars. And he's on a hunger strike, and it's the 82nd day of his hunger strike, and I'm worried sick about him. And yeah, so this is for Ali. In this town, we rescue cats. Amid November's raid, the journalists at the office learned to make paper boats to pass the time. Suddenly, there were as many boats as people, except not one boat had a name. It is November again. The boats collect dust in the corner of the newsroom. We sip coffee, sniff each whiskered abscess on the lips of our strays as officers question the salted lines around Kareem's eyes. In our quest for temporary exits, we name strays, we make homes in our terrible freedom, which blinks, which mortifies us. To pass the time, we strain questions like water through a round mesh riddle. Here, anything can be an editorial question. Like, can a piece of paper, however quaintly folded, be a lifeboat? Who takes a man post-swim from the Red Sea? Who takes care of his strays? We sip coffee, wipe peppercorns of grime off the lips of our languid, useless boats. November again, the future is a cold room with a bare bed frame. Okay. I invited my mom to this, but I think she didn't make it, which is great because I wanted to read a poem. And then after I invited her, I was like, I don't want to read this while she's here. It betrays a very alive resentment. On the 20th anniversary of my parents' divorce, which I am not getting over apparently ever. So this is called Because of My Mother. I know cravings because of my mother. I was born with pale green grapes on my pelvis because of my mother. I know nipples because of my mother. I know the ginger stain of henna because of my mother. I know rice pudding, cotton balls, and milk tea because of my mother. 6 spoons of sugar because of my mother. I'm always 6 because of my mother. As a girl in the Mediterranean, I almost drowned because of my mother. I could never swim because of my mother. I found the chest of my father because of my mother. When a man is really angry, I laugh because of my mother. When I'm really scared, I laugh because of my mother. I feed on the soft skin inside my lips because of my mother. Every time I touch my clitoris, I smell its stink because of my mother. The wrong fruit because of my mother. I'm afraid of my fingers because of my mother. The sounds I make embarrass me because of my mother. I think I should sleep very still because of my mother. I thought no man, no woman would touch me because of my mother. I did not shave until I was 26 because of my mother. I know how hair yields to sugar because of my mother, how hairless my mother. I'm a child in a mermaid costume because of my mother, flaxen grass around my lips because of my mother, a goat grazing deserts looking for a mother. I found mothers in classrooms in the desert one spring because of my mother. In dream after dream, I am yellow. I am as yellow as a migrant dog in a cave without a mother. I lick open the mouths of caves because of my mother. I translate the wind because of my mother. Everywhere I go, I make a temporary mosque because of my mother. I sift through the rice grain by grain looking for stones because of my mother. I feed everyone else before myself because of my mother. I could never get the meat cubes to soften because of my mother. In Cairo, after New York, I had a house to stay in because of my mother. The curtains a sickening yellow because of my mother. I moved so slow that year because of my mother. The nutritionist said I was addicted to sugar because of my mother. I cut out sugar because of my mother. I was convinced the bed was infested with bugs because of my mother. My back bled for days because of my mother. I burned the mattress because of my mother. The lights here are blinding because of my mother. I am dreaming of two identical mothers, and I do not scream because maybe one of them is my mother. Both chew their bright orange lips in the same mirror. For years, I collected negatives of wombs because of my mother. My own womb is crawling out of itself, and where is my mother? I am an egg left in the care of crows because of my mother. I sleep hungry because of my mother. All night, my lung licks itself because of my mother. Air needles undercover, fear as insoluble as sulfur. I dissolve sugar in lukewarm water because of my mother. I am bad with water because of my mother, bad with fire because of my mother. I sweeten even the softest grapes because of my mother, put my ears to my pelvis because of my mother. I don't know where the pain is because of my mother. I think if I sleep very still, I will become my mother. I know time can stop because of my mother. How do I peel the years off my face and give them to my mother? Put back my milk teeth, untrain my bladder. I want to stay young and wait for a mother. Instead, I am swimming right into my mother. Okay. I kept looking at the waiting room. Thank you for listening to this. I always feel like this is like a poem that I put on people and not share with them. I don't know. But if I can do it, you can, I think. Okay, so yeah. This next poem is called House Arrest, and it's a prose poem. I wish you could see it. It looks very not interesting because it's a prose poem, but it's my favorite form to write in, I think. So here we go, House Arrest. There's a light that makes everything beautiful, even the animals we blindfold to stop seeing ourselves in their eyes. In my mind, I am a bad swimmer on the shore of a large body of sludge. Each morning, I stand back and stagger, like a cow knifed by an unskilled butcher. My desire as dull as memory in the womb of a mountain. I practice my bad stroke on flat, dry land, always in the night. I see mothers packing fresh meat in plastic bags, their boys slipping in new puddles of blood, which catch the light beautifully. Cheap firecrackers flying apart. Sometimes to distract myself, I rearrange the furniture, place cubed meat by the door, and greet the fear like a neighbor. Some days I find glass in the corners and I'm not afraid. I'm good. I'm good. I'm good today. But there are too many days, and sacrificial cattle keep hemorrhaging in my chest, blunt knives in their eyes. No one will tell me what's wrong. Okay. This next one is just a poem, not a prose poem, and it's called Bat Temple. The doctor says the lining of my uterus is migrating into its walls. Displaced, the tissue continues to act normally, thickening, breaking down, and bleeding. The pain is worse now than before. I lay out traps for the new mouse and remove them before he comes close. I know panic like a tongue, nose, and unlit mouth. I'm thinking it must be dark inside the body, and where do dreams find light to give us hungry dogs, bags of shaved organs, and the infant left indigo by a plump tamarind pod? I want the light and I don't want the light. After everything I read online, I am now convinced the migration started early. When the uterus is first formed in the fetus, experts suggest endometrial tissue wanders from the uterus like a rogue angel from heaven. I call my mother to ask her if when she first held me, she could tell something inside me was leaving. She says I was so hungry, I was yellow. I was as small as the belly of a cat. What are you doing about the mouse? I don't want to pronounce the word anticoagulant. I don't want to think it. I'm listening to the walls like music. Sleeping, old towels beneath me like secrets. Again, I hold no milk in the slim body of a scalpel. All the bodies I've housed now, fugitives in the light. The doctor says, you are a bad temple. I tell her I know. All these years I've known the blood was threshold, signal, was never ornamental. Okay, thank you everyone for staying with me. I think I'll just read one more. It's called Garden City. And Garden City is a neighborhood in Cairo, even though it's a really cool word or phrase. Okay, Garden City. There is a black and white portrait of my grandparents on their wedding day, framed with a red velvet trim in the small house of my childhood, where my grandmother taught me to pray. She'd stuff my head in one of her many prayer scarves, which held me like a tent. I'd bend and bow and whisper the way she whispered, each of us speaking to God like we knew him. Near the end, her index finger fluttered frantically off her right knee as she murmured, I witness, I witness. We turned our necks from side to side, chins digging into each shoulder like a pillow as we whispered goodbye to the angels. Every winter, my aunt gets 10 kilos of red carrots delivered to her door, which she crushes and softens to make a viscous crimson jam. Her secret ingredient is ground cloves. The first time she gave me a jar, it was nearly summer. My grandfather had just died. When I pulled it out of the fridge, it was months later. I could think of nothing else to eat. Discovering small blue circles unblinking on the surface, I closed my eyes and ate it anyway. As a child, I'd escape into the kitchen and watch my grandmother finger through a large dish of uncooked rice for small stones. She always complained I never said much, never took the peeled oranges she offered. I always was a quiet animal. I was happiest when she put me in a chair and gave me a toasted slice of fatir, which I hid beneath a small hill of powdered sugar. She'd go back to reading the rice. I watch her hands and say nothing as I ate. It was only when I got older, my grandmother told me their wedding portrait was taking years after they'd been married and when they finally had enough saved for a studio. By then, they'd had my aunt, who crawled and hid beneath the puff of her mother's white skirt. It was too early to imagine anyone's room in the dirt. They looked straight into the box camera, and they did not hold hands. There are photographs of my grandparents on every beach in the country, in Mecca, outside the Valley of the Kings, by the High Dam in the south. After they buried their son, my grandmother signed them up for every possible trip. There is one of them on the north coast, my grandfather's mustache graying, his belly circular and wet. In the photo, my grandmother is watching the Mediterranean turn emerald, a large straw hat deflecting the sun. Last summer, when I visited for rice pudding and broth, I told her I've been waking up scared. In my dreams, I swallow stones that sift all the way to my toes. After asking if I also see any blood, she told me she has given up reading dreams. When she moved to a different room to pray, I slipped out to the balcony for a smoke. Resting on the railing, I spotted a ceramic dish with a mountain of powdered sugar, ants circling the peak like pilgrims, nesting in the grooves. The reddening air was holding the echoes of prayers like newborns. When I asked her why there was a plate of sugar on the balcony, her head still peeking through the tent, she said, "What were you doing on the balcony?" The way I remember it, light stippled the spot on the Persian carpet where, in prostration, our fingers would touch. Maybe it didn't. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. That was it from me for now.
Thank you, Sara. Oh, hi, Mirene. Let me introduce you.
Okay, sure.
Sara, that was terrific. Thank you so much. So Mirene Arsanios is going to come in and take part in a conversation with Sara and Mona. Mirene is the author of the short story collection, The City Outside the Sentence, and more recently, Notes on Mother Tongues, which was published in 2020 by Ugly Duckling Press. She's contributed essays and short stories to Eflux Journal, Vita, The Rail, LitHub, and Guernica, among others. She co-founded the collective 98 Weeks research project in Beirut and is the founding editor of Moxzine, a bilingual English-Arabic magazine for innovative writing. With Rachel Valinsky, she coordinated the Friday night reading series at the Poetry Project from 2017 to 2019. And her next book, The Autobiography of the Language, is forthcoming this year from Future Poem. Please welcome Mirene Arsanios.
Thank you, Anselm. Thank you, everyone at the Brooklyn Rail. And thank you, especially Mona and Sara, for these gorgeous, gorgeous readings. I'm still sort of taking everything in. I feel this was so rich and in so many ways that I'm going to try to sort of unpack here with you. So much to say, but I'm just going to sort of react and respond to what you just read. It was really interesting to hear you read your poems in the language in which they were written, in English and Arabic, and also read translations. I was trying to almost detect if there was like any sort of any sort of feature to distinguish the poems from the translation, and that was really hard for me. I feel that they were, both the translations and the poem were so embodied and so viscerally sort of written that I couldn't say, not that translations are stiffer than poems and their original versions, but I do feel sometimes I do feel a difference sometimes between an original poem and a translation. And in this case, it was really hard for me to distinguish what was a poem, what was a translation. And you're both poets and translators, and you wear both these hats. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it was for you to collaborate as poets and translators and work with each other's work. Like, is being a poet translator give you, does it give you like insights onto the working process, or how does it sort of, how is the working process different from your perspectives that are from these kind of multiple perspectives? I don't know if the question is clear, but I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about inhabiting both these positions and working together, and how that sort of affected your collaboration.
Mona, should I start and then?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, Mirene, thank you for your question. So maybe we can frame it a little bit. Mona and I met last year during this translation seminar organized by Tames, who bring people together, basically, who are poet translators, and we work in pairs and translate each other's work. Mona and I did not work together during the seminar last summer. We were both working with other people. And then, but I remember we had conversations throughout the seminar where, for example, Mona, when she heard my work translated into Arabic, she kind of said, "Oh, it sounds like it should be in Arabic," or like that Arabic is a very fitting home for your work, because I think in my writing, I translate my experiences mostly from Egypt and in this language that I'm living, which is Arabic and not necessarily English. So there is like a translation of life and not language necessarily when I write. But anyway, and I think, like many collaborations, it kind of happened organically, where after the seminar we exchanged work, and then we decided to start working together on a full-length collection of that gathers together Mona's work from over the past 20 years, including work that she's still producing now. And it's been, I have worked with other people to translate their work, none as extensively as I've worked with Mona. But I think the practice is really, it's so different from writing my own work, because in ways it's easier at the beginning, or like the starting is easier when versus when I write my own poems, when I'm starting from scratch. But when I'm translating, I'm starting with an existing text that someone else has already started for me. But then and then some decisions that I'm making, where in my own work there seems to be infinite decisions for direction, or for like how to develop the piece, or for structure, or for form. All of these questions are kind of answered before I begin to translate. But then the one question that I'm still really struggling to address is how to revise translated poems. And that I don't have an answer for from the writer necessarily, because, well, I tried to translate what they have created and revised into this draft, and then this draft is still not working for me. And I think that's where I'm struggling the most. But okay, Mona, do you want to take over and talk more?
Yeah, thank you, Sara. That's yeah, I think there is certain things we're observing about our shared collaboration, but also to link back to what Mirene was saying about the poet translator, which is like, it's really a figure, right? Like the poets who like partake in translation simultaneous to their work throughout their life. It's and come from an appreciation for what literary translation does, and approach translation as a poet, which not to reinforce the whole hierarchy of like, or this division of labor of like the poet is an artist, the translator is a worker, right? I think that's the beauty of the poet translator figure, is that both come together, because art is necessarily labor, and labor, is necessarily art, right? Like, and I feel like I feel so lucky that like Sara is the one to do this, because from my experience with other translators who worked on not all of them, but like some translator who've translated my work, the process was very much done in separation, right? Like in the sense that they do something and then I look at it, and then and I give some notes and so on. While when you are a poet translator, you arrive to the text with a certain confidence of, and like you come with the writing process as your mode, not the translation process, because the translation process necessarily gives it still relies on the authority of the author, basically. So like I hate it when in translation it becomes an exchange of permissions, and I must answer. Like sometimes I don't have answers. Yeah, I wrote the poem, doesn't mean I have answers, right? Like, so answers can become like shared or collaborative, improvised, and so on. So that is like really enjoyable. And I always tell, whenever I teach like a translation class or workshop or something like this, I encourage translators to write more. Like I say, translation is a genre. It is not something separate of, or like parallel to literature or something. So like a good translator is necessarily someone who partakes in different genres, like, to expand their horizon and, like possibilities, because all of us are still working within aesthetics, right? Like we're still like, partaking in this. Yeah, and I can say more about the poet translator figure, because you remember, Mirene, when you invited me for Makhzen and when the subway, like I focused exactly on this figure and how big it is in modern Arabic poetry. Like all the big poets were necessarily translators, and that was part of like, changing a whole, like a generation changing, and a whole domain, really, like it couldn't be separated, writing a poem and translating one.
Yeah, and I love that fluidity, and I think there's something really refreshing in your collaboration, in as much as like translation doesn't have this kind of agenda of making sort of the non-Western other legible to the Western reader. It's kind of unburdened by this. What it used to be, its own history in a way, and there's something extremely contemporary and in the making. There's this, it's very sort of grounded in the process, and as a listener, I could really feel that there was a lot of trust and a lot of freedom as well in your collaboration. So I find this extremely refreshing. And I wanted to ask you, Mona, just if you could comment a little bit on the term untranslating, because untranslations, sorry. If you could say a little bit more about that, and just maybe another note, just thinking about your collaboration as a process that feels very free. Going back to your poem, Nebraska, Mona, where there are sort of permissions to be asked and permits to be requested. And so the practice of translation is almost kind of enacts a certain space of freedom, while the sort of content of the poem negotiates, the realities of having to sort of live in a world where sort of borders are very real, and etc. This was just a note, but I was thinking of this idea of freedom in your collaboration. But I'd love to hear about untranslations, if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share with us.
Thank you, Mirene. Thank you for picking also on this permissions, right? Like, because that has been largely my experience as an exiled writer in the US is, and like at some point I thought like, it's really annoying how much like being like the writer figure shows up in my poetry, and I was trying to critique this, but then I was like, yeah, actually, like that is how I exist in this country, like especially socially, right? And my experience has been so. In my new collection, one of the things that I'm doing is like grieving the loss of the Arabic poet as we know him, and I say him deliberately because it was largely like a men's world, and with all the critiques of the fact that it's a men's world, still there was so much beauty to it. For example, the fact that the Arab poet had the task of like smuggling history into the present moment. That's what I describe it in a poem. Like the Arabic poet was always part of the collective, part of like the moment. Like while since like the 80s up until now, poets have become like novelists. They write in the future about the past. There is no present moment anymore, you know, and I grieve this, you know. And I arrived, like, as a writer, I started writing in the 2000s. Like I arrived into this reality, and all I can do is write about the loss. I cannot undo it, really, you know. And I say this because, you know, when I came to the US, like, this loss was magnified to me, because here I am writing in Arabic from afar, and people are reading me back home, but I can't feel that reading. I cannot feel like who's reading, what is reading, what is, you know. And I just felt so solitary, you know, when I used, as a poet back home, I did not feel like this solitude. Even if we were a small group, even if we were on the margin, there was like community, and community isn't easy to find in the US. Like, as Arabs, we don't have one center in the US, you know, for example, like the concentration. If we do, we don't necessarily all speak Arabic as a first language or write in it. So there's so much stratification for you as like a diaspora, but then add to that, like, you know, so I thought, okay, you know, I guess it will take that I have to write in English, you know, like, to find community. And funny enough, I don't. You know, like, I write these poems, but that doesn't necessarily like find community, you know. But maybe I find community in the more abstract sense of that, like, I start to think like, oh wow, this country has always had exiled writers who struggled with this and who had to write in two languages, you know, writers of the Soviet Union, you know, writers of Latin America. And then, of course, like, the whole Mahjar movement, like, the first really formed exiled group in the US was an Arab American group. And these, like, people helped inspire me and calm me down, and like, embrace like this place of tension that I will always exist in, right? Like, so I call this untranslation, because when I used to submit my poems, and like, I want to say, like, Aslam, like, was one of those people who didn't do this to me. And that's why I love him for life, you know, is when I submit poems, they would ask me, did you write this in English, you know, or is this a self-translation, or, you know. And it's like, why does this matter? It's like a poem, you know. If it's good, take it. If it's not, leave it, right? Like, so, and, or sometimes they would tell me, oh, there's an Arab anthology, but you can't submit an English poem because it's Arabic, you know. So how do you like divide me? I am one person writing in two languages. How do you govern me? How do you, you know, like, say, like, you can contribute here, but not there, and so on and so forth, you know. So, this and this is something I find like more beautiful about my collaboration with Sara, is that this is not about a bridge. This is not about access. This is not, it just, a lot of my poems happen to be in Arabic, and Sara like read, you know, work, as you mentioned, like three poetry collections, and selected them. So it's been beautiful, like, revisiting myself through her, and vice versa.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. Sara, do you want to say something in that regard, in terms of perhaps this idea of also just to follow what Mona was saying about community and finding readership, but also accepting that the readership itself is kind of splintered or scattered, and there's kind of diasporic reality that has its own history, as Mona was saying, right? And so how do you navigate your own voice via, you know, these multiple contexts and conditions of linguistic conditions, and also readerships, etc. And I know that Mona, you also talk about multiple selves, right? Yeah. So perhaps, do you want to say something about these about selfhood, and how you sort of navigate this very sort of these different landscapes?
Yeah. I love, do you want to say something about selfhood as like its own question? Yeah, so I just finished an MFA at NYU, and working in New York and writing for the workshop was definitely a strange experience where I felt like I it's not that I didn't have good readers, I did, but even in my own process and in deciding what to write about, I felt like I had to explain myself in a certain way or translate myself, and not write anything that is like too outside the realm of understanding in a US context. And I think like I have spent 8 years in New York, and I never once wrote a poem about New York, and I just don't feel like my like the land that I'm drawing from, that like sprouts my poems is necessarily in the US, and I think that has to do with like what I'm really writing about, which is like if I had to answer that annoying question, what do you write about? It would be like childhood, gender, political injustice, and anxiety. So it's like, okay, well, all of that is kind of rooted in my life here and growing up here. So I tried to tell myself to like be okay with being outside of the MFA program and everything that it offers in terms of like community, and it does offer community and like friendships and also just structure. And now I don't have that anymore. So I was trying to tell myself, oh, but then you'll be in Cairo, spending more time there and like closer to the source. But then I feel like in the absence of the MFA, no one is really reading my drafts, except for Mona and a few other people. But yeah, so I think I'm excited about what the prospect of being outside of the MFA and writing poems that look like poems, and deal in the subject matter that a lot of the poetry today is dealing in. And yeah, and if I wouldn't need to translate myself so much outside of that structure. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. It does. Thank you. So we have a question in the chat, which I could pick up on, but before that, perhaps I'd like to ask you, and just this is one image that stayed with me while I was listening to you read, and there's a theme of sleep or insomnia that comes through in your readings, Mona. And I was also referring to some of the poems of the anthology that Tamas is releasing soon on contemporary era poets. And sleep is also present, both as a kind of as a space for dreaming, but also as a space of insomnia, as a space of exhaustion, as a highly surveilled space as well. And referring back to your poem, Nebraska, I was thinking of, the permission of for sleep that you mentioned in the poem. Do you want to say something about sleep, Mona, or insomnia, or perhaps and how this relates to the liminal zone as well of multiple languages or multiple selves, or there's something that's being negotiated in that sort of liminal zone? Do you want to say a few words about sleep and what it means to you as a motif in your work?
Yeah, thanks, Mirene. Honestly, I never paid attention to that, but maybe recently there was one thing that, like sometimes people tell me like, oh, I didn't know English is your second language, or you speak English well, it's like, yeah, I have 3 degrees from American universities. Probably I speak better English than you, you know. But it's like this thing of like, of like people asking about like the hierarchies of language in your life, but also asking you this question of like, what language do you do you dream in, or what language do you like make love in, you know, things like that, you know, which is really folklore, you know, because I remember Googling and, you know, researching like, where does this theory come from about like dreams, language and dreams, you know, like, and Freud, you know, poor man, he's always been like accused of like making up such a theory. He didn't, you know, he never talked about that actually. And he was more concerned with language late in his life in exile. And then, yeah, so I kept looking in psychology, is there such a thing, you know, because the truth is like when I sleep and I dream, they feel to me like silent movies, you know, like I really never like feel like there's a sentence that I wake up with, you know, and I feel like in my dreams people speak with their eyes or with their body rather than in a language. You know, so I wrote a poem exactly about this, but this is more recently because this I know I was agitated by this question, but never had an answer to it. But I like sleep and insomnia, let's say, yeah, insomnia more, to me has been exhausting in both senses. Like first, when you get to exile, you notice like just simply the time difference, right? Like I remember coming to the States in 2011 and which is like, you know, a high time in the Arab world. Like, so I lived at, you know, I lived some of it in the Arab world, and then I moved to the US, and I remember trying to physically resist the time difference, you know, and like would stay up late or like would wake up early because every time I wake up, like things have already happened in back home, you know, and like there was like a revolution and it ended, and you know, and here I am just reading about it in news, you know, and in California it's even worse. But at some point you get defeated, and at some point you realize like this is just your condition, you know, like literally as an exilee, you no longer get a say, you know, in that event. You no longer are there, you no longer a political subject, you know, like, yes, you can intellectually, you know, like, I don't know, contribute and commentate and all of that, but really you have been stripped of your right or your place from that collective, you know, it's really heartbreaking. And then I think about insomnia in the Nebraska poem, where I mean, the vastness of the US is really scary, you know, because like every time I file any immigration paper, it goes to Nebraska because like that's the field office for the East Coast. And that's all I know about Nebraska is that all my immigration stuff goes there. I have no idea what is Nebraska, what's the capital city, like nothing, you know? So yeah, like I feel like maybe as you picked on this, like somehow insomnia like is how I express like the anxiety of displacement in a way.
Great, thank you, Mona. So we have a question from the audience from Nancy, who asks you, Mona, could you expand on what you said about contemporary poets losing the present by focusing on future and past?
Yeah, to give like the most prominent example is really of like Mahmoud Darwish, for example, you know, like, or maybe a less familiar example would be someone like the Egyptian poet Emel Dinqal, really amazing, like political poet who always like borrowed from Greek mythology and like Greek, the big, you know, Western canon pieces, you know, and reproduced them in the context of the 60s in the Arab world, you know, socialism, communism, all of that, you know, of course, the Palestine, Israel, you know, context especially. So there are so many incidents like in Egyptian history of like revolt that only survive as poems, you know, and I find this so beautiful. This is something I love about Sara's poetry, by the way, because in contemporary Egyptian poetry, so many poets have overlooked Egyptian revolution, thinking it is not the place of the poet anymore to talk about this moment, you know? Like I give this example of Imad Abu Saleh. He is the only one to talk about Egyptian revolution, and the book is titled "The Revolution Happened and I Was Sleeping," you know, or No One Woke Me Up, you know. So like this really tells you about the relationship of the Arab poet to the to the history, to the moment, and so on. And I like to challenge this, and I was inspired by like Sara's new work on revisiting January 25th, you know, and yeah, like these aesthetic expectations of the 90s that, oh, we should just like withdraw from this, you know, we should not be engaged, you know. I don't think this fulfills my role as a writer. But to go back to the example of Darwish, you know, like, and after the Madrid negotiations, you know, PLO and the Israelis, Darwish was there, and then he wrote أحد عشر كوكبا. I don't know how to translate this, but 11 planets, like, I don't know how, and which is like really an amazing, you know, collection, and, you know, one of the best in modern Arabic poetry, well, like, translated already into English. And this man was, you know, like this poet was there, and he witnessed that moment, right before the Oslo Accords, and he writes a whole book about it. You know, that doesn't happen anymore. You know, so like, this is what I mean when I say that, like, yeah, like, sadly we become novelists who wait until the event is done and like try to reflect on it. You know, so there is this a rupture or like a transformation of like the poet's place and the poet's relation to collective and to the historical.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mona. We don't have any more questions from the audience. Do you two have questions from each other that you'd like, or something else that you'd like to address before we end the conversation?
I actually would like it if Sara talks about her revolution poems.
Okay, so yeah, recently I've been doing research on this incident that happened during the revolution, where women were taken to a military place in the desert. They were in a sit-in, and then they were taken from the sit-in, and then there were virginity tests done on these women protesters that were intended to intimidate them, probably, and then there was a lawsuit filed by one of the victims, and then this practice has been outlawed now, which is great. But I, like, the kind of research that I did was basically listening to testimonies and transcribing and translating the testimonies, and then thinking about how I can work these into poems that preserve the sense of testimony, which is something I still have questions around, like why use the poem format, and how much to preserve the original language, and what is my place to intervene and kind of frame it differently, or just play with the language in any way. So that's something that I'm still working through. And then in other cases, I think I have this impulse to, so I come from a journalistic background. I worked in journalism for 10 years before switching to poetry. And I think I'm still really affected by this idea of personal narratives, and how personal narratives are ultimately what stays with people. So I think what I'm trying to do is to capture through poems just individuals who participated in the revolution, and but I'm doing it from this 10-year distance also. So it's kind of like I work with stories that people still tell about these people, or I work with news articles or just what I remember about that moment, because it's so far away. But you know how it is, like the impulse to write about something is something you can't always, it's not a mission per se that I want to preserve the stories from the revolution. It's more of like something that I keep being drawn to because the anger is still alive and the fear is still alive. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Sara. And this is a collection you're working on right now, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Does it have a title?
Working title is Keep, but
Okay.
we'll see. I have no idea what's happening with this collection. It's kind of a mess right now. Maybe I have one last question for Mona. So I don't know if we've discussed this, but I feel like whenever I tell anyone that I'm working with you to translate your work, they're like, oh, why doesn't Mona just translate herself? And I always feel like it's kind of like they're trying to offend me. It's like, oh. But I realize it's coming more from a place of, oh, you could do that if you wanted to. So I think just to kind of make myself feel better about it, but also to understand, I just want to ask you why you chose to work with someone and not do it yourself.
Yeah, I think you chose me.
That might be true.
Yeah. No, honestly, just as I mentioned earlier, I really feel like I tried a lot to rationalize my decision why do I write this poem in English? Why do I write it in Arabic? Why would I translate it, into the other language? And a lot of the times it's just coincidence, really. Or reasons that I can't like consciously reach to. But I did contemplate, because I've seen writers, especially Latin American writers or Latino writers in the US, who would do this, or write a whole book in their first language, and then maybe you can call it self-translation, but you can also call it like a rewriting into English, and I experimented with this a few, but I don't feel like I have an urgency to do this. I feel like also, I think also because there are so many Spanish speakers in the US, like that really makes sense in their experience. But I haven't seen like an urgency or a need to try to do so much of that labor, right? Instead, I'm more interested in just writing directly in either language and see how it goes. And it's been beautiful for me as a writer. First, of course, there was so much self-doubt and what am I doing, when I started writing in English poetry, especially. But then I realized it's made me has made me a better poet in Arabic too, because I was able to take a distance. I was able to question things that I used to take for granted about, like, what are my aesthetics, so this kind of, maybe this orientation helped me, reground myself in a new way. So aesthetically, it's been a great learning process, but yeah, I prefer that you translate me, honestly.
And Mona, do you ever rework your poems based on the translation? The reason I'm asking is because I was talking once with Sara Riggs, who is Italian's translator, one of Italian's translator into English. And Sara Riggs was telling me that she had translated an Ital poem and then showed Ital the translation, and then Ital rewrote her poem based on Sarah's translation. So I was wondering if that ever happened with you.
I mean, the thing is, Italian is like the queen of doing this, like she's amazing. She writes in French and then translates herself and back, like sometimes there are texts of her that we don't actually have any proof that which language they were written in, so that once I realized this about her, I was like, wow, she's amazing. She doesn't need permission. She just does it. And like, she doesn't tell us like what language she wrote it in, you know, and you gotta just experience it this way. So, but to answer you, like with Sara, especially with the older poems, there were things that I was just telling Sara, like, we can just like change this, you know, or like take this off, like, you know, and it's like, we laugh because it feels like a, you know, a secret, like dirty thing we're doing. And like a lot of the times with her, I really feel like I'm not the author. I feel like both of us are conspiring against the author, you know? Yeah.
I absolutely love this. This is so great. Yeah, thank you both so much. This has been it's been really a pleasure to just listen to you talk about your work and your process. Yeah, I think, does anyone else want to add anything before we leave? Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Mirene, for guiding the conversation and for your questions. Thank you, Sara and Mona, for the reading and the discussion. This is great to go into the rest of the day with. And thanks everybody for being here. I will unmute everybody's mics so you can sort of say hello and goodbye at the same time, and then join us again next week.
All right. Thank you, Anselm.
Thank you all so much.
Everyone.
Thanks,
That was so great.
Well,
Bye.
Really grateful.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take care.
Everyone, thank you.